Rugby World Rankings. I'm going to talk a little bit about how these world rankings work. It's a video I've talked about doing for a long time, but I'm just finally getting around to now. I've decided not to really do a deep dive on the maths. If it's the formula that you're interested in, I will link in the description. I think the Wikipedia page has a pretty good section about how exactly the formula calculates things. And there are plenty of calculators you can use, just web-based websites basically you can go to. You can punch in two teams, put in an imaginary result, and it will tell you what the calculation would have been in terms of their change in world rankings. So I'm not going to do a deep dive on the maths in this one. I'm essentially going to talk about some of the overarching theory behind how the world rankings work, some of the things that I think are a bit weak about it, and basically just an overall about how they work. So maybe next time you look at those world rankings, because they always stir up a bit of debate about which team is ranked too highly, which team is ranked, being a bit hard done by. So we've seen the number one slot go between a few teams in the last 12 months. So as I said, it always stirs up a bit of debate. But hopefully this, and plus I'm sure some guys will add stuff in the comments, will give you guys a bit of a insight into just to how they work the way they do. So the first point I've put on the board is points exchange. And that is essentially, it's World Rugby's wording. It's the guiding principle of how these world rankings work. So every team has a points score based on how many games they've won and who they won and what they beat them by and where they beat them and all that kind of stuff. So like for example, some of the teams at the minute, the Springboks have 94.19 points, which is pretty high. The All Blacks in second are 92.11. Uruguay, who's a fair bit further down the ladder, are on 67.41. What can I say? I wanted to put the Uruguay jersey on. It's been a while. So, it keeps going. If you keep going down, you can get into the 30s. Teams like China, and whatnot are all represented. Basically, if you play test matches, you'll be on the world rankings there somewhere. So what does this points exchange mean? It means when two teams play, in theory, whoever wins the game will take points from the losing team and add them to their own score. So if the All Blacks were to beat South Africa, they would take some of this 94.19 and add it to their own score. So New Zealand would go up and South Africa's score would come down. You can't just get points from thin air. You have to take them from someone else, or you have to lose them to someone else. So essentially that's what the points exchange mean. How many points you get or how many points you lose is dependent on a few factors. It could be what kind of tournament you're playing in. It's a pretty simple one in that if it's a Rugby World Cup, it's double any other game. So if it's the Six Nations, if it's the Rugby Championship, if it's end of year tour, if it's mid-year tour, all those games, Rugby World Cup warm-up games, if it's a test match but it's not the World Cup, those are all calculated with one formula. And it's the same formula, but if it's Rugby World Cup, it's times 2. The formula is doubled for Rugby World Cup. So that's one factor to kind of keep in mind about how it works. So during the Rugby World Cup times, you see teams jumping up and down with a lot higher rate because the amount of points they're gaining and losing is so much more at that time. Home advantage is one factor. If you are at home, the way the formula works, and again, if you want to read it in detail, feel free to do so, but essentially they buff your base score slightly if you are at home. So they are saying at home, you should be the stronger team. So we're giving you, or you should have a better chance, which kind of makes sense because most teams have a far better record at home than they do away. So home advantage is one thing they take into consideration. You're more likely to take points from a team if you can beat them away. You're less likely to gain so many points if you win at home. Again, the logic is pretty simple. The way the formula calculates gets a little bit more in depth. The margin is also a factor, but again, it's a pretty simple one in that if you win by from 1 point to 14 points, they calculate the formula at kind of the base level. If you win by 15 points or more, they calculate it slightly higher. So you get more points for beating teams by 15 points or more. If you beat them by 20 or 50 or 100, it's the same as if you beat them by 15. Likewise, if you beat them by 1 or 5 or 10 or 14, it's all the same. So that's only that one dividing line. It's 15 points or it's nothing. So yeah, if you get a real 57-0, might as well be 15-0 in terms of the world rankings. It is essentially the same thing. Draws, there's not a lot of points exchange going on if there's a draw, but it will slightly give the underdog some points, because I guess it's kind of crediting them for at least drawing a game that they should have won. So yeah, that's only been what 6 minutes? It's pretty simple, right? Home advantage, you take points from other teams, you lose points if you lose, you get points if you win. I should have mentioned, if you're playing a team which is miles below you, you're not going to get any points. That's just the way it works. I think it's like 10 points. It might be a bit less. But yeah, if you are miles ahead of another team and you beat them even by 100 points, it's not going to make a difference. You're not going to get any points from that. But if you can beat a team who is far above you, you're more likely to rake in some serious pointage in that situation. So yeah, I think for the most part, it's pretty straightforward. Is it perfect? Definitely not. Definitely not. It has a few pretty obvious flaws, and again, there's no system which is going to be perfect. Like I try to do power rankings for Super Rugby, and I'm fortunate in that I can keep the way I work it out to myself, because I've done it for a few years now, and every year I've had to tweak it because I find over time it starts to look wrong, and I have to do kind of manual adjustments. So World Rugby can't do that because they have to tell everyone what they're doing, and they've had this in place for a long time. So one thing, you could call it a weakness, you may not agree with it, but one of the things, and this is World Rugby's wording, is a heroic loss. So if Uruguay was to come to Auckland and play the All Blacks, where they haven't lost in 20 plus years, and they were to lose by 1 point, they get no credit for that result. If you're a big time underdog and you get close but can't quite get it done, you might as well have lost by 14 points, because it makes no difference to the world ranking. So World Rugby would say, we're not going to reward a loser, which is fair enough. Like rugby sometimes has a losing bonus point if you get within 7, but for the most part, we don't really reward the losing team. So likewise, the world rankings don't reward losing teams with any kind of bonus. However, I think what also that kind of means is you get some situations like Italy and Georgia, where the teams, and possibly you could say Argentina as well, and some of the other teams are not in the right place, basically. Italy plays in the Six Nations, so they are regularly playing some of the top teams in the world. They're regularly playing England, who's been number 1 in the world, Ireland, Wales, likewise. From my recent video on the Six Nations attendance, people say maybe their best chances against Scotland, and they play France as well, who's kind of inconsistent, but sometimes up, sometimes down. And so Italy's ranking's really low because you can't get any points for losing, so they generally don't get many points on the world rankings. Georgia, on the other hand, are in kind of an awkward position, and they're too good for most of their other European opposition, so they rack up a lot of wins. So they're getting a bunch of points. Italy are not. So on the world rankings table, Georgia's above Italy. I think it's 12th Georgia and 14th Italy. When they last played, who won? Italy. Kind of not surprising to anyone who follows the game. But if you were a first-time rugby fan and you just looked at the world rankings and you were going to put some money on the game, you would look at it and go, okay, Georgia should be the favourite because they are the higher-ranked team. It doesn't work that way. So I think that's one kind of big weakness. Like I said, Argentina as well. They play the All Blacks, Springboks, and Wallabies in the Rugby Championship. They generally finish last most years. They're a good team, but the way the World Rankings works, it doesn't give them much love. So they also have a pretty bad ranking. One thing I also think doesn't make a lot of sense is any game which coaches might be tempted to not play their strongest team counts the same as every other tournament. So for example, Rugby World Cup warm-up games, we saw coaches experiment with their lineups. They played a lot of different players, and maybe teams lost by either margins they might not have, or maybe they lost games they wouldn't have ordinarily lost, or it was not close, whatnot. That counts the same as the Six Nations Grand Slam decider. That counts the same as the Springboks victory over the All Blacks here in 2018. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. The fact that the weighting is only for the Rugby World Cup and everything else is the same keeps it simple, but I don't think it's kind of a fair reflection of the pressure that goes on the players and whatnot. There's other things I could go on about, but those are kind of the main ones. I wanted to keep it fairly short, fairly kind of high level, just a general look at the way the rankings are and how they work. So do check out the World Rugby's explanation page. They go through a few more points. It's all pretty brief. And there's those calculators you can play with if you really want to see what would happen if Uruguay went into South Africa and beat them. But essentially that's the system. It's points exchange. It credits the home team with that extra bit of advantage. Rugby World Cups count for twice as much. The only margin that matters is 15 points, and draws generally favour the underdog. That's pretty much it in a nutshell. As I said, not a perfect system, but it's the one World Rugby go with. What do you guys reckon? How do you think this could be improved? Any teams that you think are ranked particularly high or particularly low based on recent events? I mentioned Argentina and Italy. What else do you reckon? And cheers guys. This one was better late than never. But I'll talk to you guys again soon. See you later.